Today we're going to talk about bias, both explicit bias and implicit bias. Explicit bias is just what most people think about when they think about bias. Garden variety bias, that people realize that they're engaging in evaluation of other people, and they recognize that that evaluation isn't very positive. So I'm going to start out. We've talked a lot about race in this class. I'm going to talk about, when I'm talking about explicit bias, talk about sexism. And we're going to begin by talking about power and stereotypes and a tale of two cases of sexism. And this is actually from a Supreme Court case that Susan Fiske testified. Well, she provided an amicus brief for, and then lectured widely on this case because it had an impact. And we'll understand that Supreme Court case a little bit by the end of this section of the lecture. And and it illustrates, I think, some important principles about explicit bias. We're going to start out with one woman who experienced sexual harassment at work. Her name was Lois Robinson, and she worked in Jacksonville, Florida, at the Jacksonville shipyards. Now, Lois worked as a welder. The welders at Jacksonville Shipyard were over 90% male. And the experience that Lois had was pretty dramatic and pretty awful sexism. Her fellow workers, the male fellow workers primarily, since that's mostly what was there, had a lot of, the environment was filled with sexist images, pinups of scantily clad and naked women. They regularly made sexual comments about her. They regularly called her nasty names, and she regularly was demeaned related to her work because she was a woman. She brought these concerns to her supervisors, and interestingly, the supervisor also had the same type of pinups throughout his office, and just said, well, what do you expect? Your coworkers are all men. You go on to work at a shipyard and you're going to be a welder. This is what you're going to get. And yeah, maybe they shouldn't have called you names, but we can't do anything about it. This is too difficult of a problem for us to handle. So I think what you see here is blatant sexism, horrible sexual harassment, and very clearly problematic. Lois Robinson sued Jacksonville shipyards for the environment, for a hostile environment, and how that may have affected her advancement, and she won. Now that case can be compared to Ann Hopkins. Ann Hopkins worked at Price Waterhouse in the 90s, and Price Waterhouse in the 90s was one of the big accounting firms, and there were only actually several at the time, and a relatively small number. And Ann Hopkins had worked there for a lot of years. And in accounting, if you don't know this, the big jump in your salary and status is when you move from being it's a little bit like law, where you move from being an associate to being a partner. And she was actually a manager, and typically people start out at a lower level in accounting, then they become managers, and then some of the managers become partners. And it's a big deal in status, and it's a big deal in salary. So what you saw with Ann Hopkins is that she was a phenomenally performing accountant. And in fact, amongst all the other managers in her office, she was the one that actually had the most billable hours and made the most money for Price Waterhouse. So there wasn't really any question whatsoever about Ann's competence. But the question about Ann is whether she was feminine enough. Ann didn't like to wear dresses or skirts. And was very assertive by everyone's calculations, including her own. or everyone's accounts, including her own. She was quite assertive, and she got her work done, and she pushed the people under her. And the question was whether Anne's personality was such that she should be allowed to become a partner. She didn't go on golf trips with the other managers, which was a common activity. She didn't go over to people's houses for dinner. But she made the company the most money. In fact, although people did say this, and it was part of it. Anne was basically seen as a bit of a bitch. That's how they described her. And she actually was passed over for promotion to partner, and it was given to other people in her office, who had clearly been less productive at work, but got along with the partners better than Anne did. So Anne sued Pricewaterhouse for sexual harassment, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. This is the case that Susan Fiske wrote the amicus brief for, and Ann Hopkins won in the Supreme Court. It was deemed as sexual harassment to require Anne to fit into a feminine stereotype in order to actually be able to be promoted to the highest levels in the accounting firm. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is that both Lois Robinson and Ann Hopkins were stereotyped. They were stereotyped in different ways, and stereotypes were used to sexually harass them in different ways. And there's not much doubt about it. They met the legal definitions of sexual harassment. The Ann Hopkins case had to go all the way to the Supreme Court, but she did win at the Supreme Court. These women were sexually harassed because of the stereotypes. What I want you to appreciate, and this is part of the analysis that Susan Fiske brought to it, is that people who are in power and people who have less power, we see through experiments that they actually have different use of stereotypes, different use of explicit bias. And what we see is those who have less power, and it makes sense, if you have less power, you have to pay attention to the boss. The boss determines your outcome. You have to look to them and pay attention. And anything that's counter-stereotypic, according to the boss, you're more likely to recognize. Because you don't want to just treat the boss with bland stereotypes. You want to know them in detail and get it right. So you're particularly likely to pay attention to counter-stereotypic information if you're in lower power. And you form a coherent impression of the person. So seeing non-stereotypic behavior and traits in one area allows you to see the person as less stereotypic in other areas. And what you really do, if you're lower power, is you're much more likely to see the person as an individual rather than a member of a social class or a social group or a stereotypic group. Now we can contrast that with those who have more power and how they think about those who are less power. And this is what you see in both the Lois Robinson case and the Ann Hopkins case. Their bosses don't pay much attention to them, who they are, and really they don't, and they don't pay much attention to the work that they do. They concerned the performance of everyone rather than focusing on the individual. They don't see individuals as they focus on the people that they're interacting with, and they use stereotypes. So Lois Robinson was a woman. It was seen as perfectly appropriate to sexualize her, to think of her as a sex object and only that. Ann Hopkins was thought of as unemotional, as a bitch. It's perfectly okay to see her as that. No individualized evaluation of either of these women. This type of thinking, like Lois Robinson, how she was treated, and Ann Hopkins, how she was treated, led Fiske and one of her colleagues, Peter Glick, to develop what I think a very important concept, which is ambivalent sexism. Ambivalent sexism, and this is generally true when we talk about any stereotype, can have two forms. On one hand, sexism can have a hostile form. Hostile sexism is very much what you saw with Lois Robinson, where women are treated very negatively, treated primarily as to be in the service of men. And people who score high in hostile sexism, they agree with statements like the world would be a better place if women supported men more and criticized them less. They agree with statements a wife should not be significantly more successful in her career than her husband. They agree with statements there are many women who get a kick out of teasing men by seeming sexually available and then refusing male advances. Now, that kind of sexism is easy to see. It's easy to see how awful it is. That's what Lois Robinson experienced. What Ann Hopkins experienced was much more, and in some ways, an equally pernicious, even though it's not so much out there in your face type of sexism. And that's called benevolent sexism. And the idea is women need to be protected and cared for. They need to be put up on a pedestal. They're needed to be treated like a China doll almost. And the expectation is that women will follow very much sexist, feminine ideals. So men who are high in benevolent sexism agree with statements like every woman should have a man to whom she can turn for help in times of trouble. They agree with statements, many women have a quality of purity that few men possess. And statements like, people are not truly happy in life unless they are romantically involved with a member of the opposite sex. So this benevolent sexism has its downsides as well. And that's part of what we'll see in just a little bit as we look at how hostile and benevolent sexism is related to important outcomes in society. What we see is that people who are high in hostile sexism, and if you go back and look at those questions, it shouldn't be too surprising, are particularly likely to sexually harass women. That's why that environment for Lois Robinson is just a clear example of hostile sexism. She was experiencing the sort of sexual harassment that flows out of hostile sexism clearly. And it doesn't even just end at hostile sexism or at sexual harassment. Hostile sexism also predicts the proclivity of men to rape. So men who have hostile sexists are the ones who are most likely to be rapists. Now, benevolent sexism, you might think, okay, how can that play a role and be like hostile sexism? Women should be protected and cared for. But what you actually see is people who are high in benevolent sexism, they actually tolerate sexual harassment. They're more likely to see that as a part of the way the world is. And so men who are high in benevolent sexism actually tolerate sexual harassment much more than men who are low in benevolent sexism. And what we'll see is what I would argue is that men who are high in benevolent sexism help create the environments that allow hostile sexism to eliminate or to exhibit its negative qualities. We also see that if we just look at studies where you look at evidence from a trial and how much consistent with this toleration of sexual harassment, when they look at rape trials and men who have been convicted and accused of rape, they're particularly likely to have shorter sentences, particularly for acquaintance rape. And so what we see is that benevolent sexism helps create this environment that tolerates sexual harassment, even horrible outcomes like rape, and benevolent sexism plays a role in that. Let me tell you about one of my favorite experiments that actually demonstrates this experimentally. It was a study by Rudman and Borgita, and what they looked at was how individual differences, including very related to hostile sexism, the propensity to sexually harass was the individual difference they looked at, and then they looked at priming of sexist images. And I'll tell you, and the way they did that actually is they showed people 20 commercials. And they kept them all the same genre. So the first commercial was about cars. The second commercial was about beer. But they paired them up so that in the priming condition, 16 of the 20 ads had images of women that were sexist and sexualized. Women were treated as sex objects and treated as not much more than that. And unfortunately, it's not very hard to see those types of commercials. So you had men who had the propensity to sexual harass or not, and then they were either primed or not with sexist ads and sexual ads that treated women like sexual objects. And then what they did is they gave them they thought these were all three different experiments that they were in. So the first one, they see the ads, then they answer some questions that shows that the ads really did prime sexist ideas and thoughts. And then they had them conduct a job interview. And in this job interview, they were interviewing a woman. Not surprisingly, that's what they're going to look at in this particular study. And they thought that the interview was going to determine whether the woman got the job. They were in a high power position, or it was just part of the training of people for interviews. They were in a low power position. So you had men who had proclivities to sexual harassment or not. You had men who had been exposed to sexist ads or not. And then they were put in a position of high or low power in which they evaluated a female applicant for a job. Now, the outcomes are not surprisingly, you'd guess with the application, how highly did they rate her? But one of the very interesting applications or other things that they looked at in the study was basically how much did they sexualize her? And the variable that they looked at is how much did the men stare at her body? And what you found is propensity to sexual harass, primed with sexualized sexist images, and being in a position of power, all of them led to rating the woman more negatively, and all of them led to looking at the woman's body more during the job interview. What's interesting about this is it's maybe not too surprising that men who have a propensity to sexual harass, who have hostile sexism, do those two things. But actually, all men, it wasn't just those men who saw the sexist ad that did those things. Men who were low in propensity to sexual harass, when they were primed with sexual images, they did the same. They did things more than men who didn't have that same sort of prime. And men who, maybe it isn't surprising that men who have propensity to sexual harass, when they're given high power, that they treat women in more demeaning ways and give them less chances in the job. But even men who were low in propensity to sexual harass, when they were in high power, they treated women more as sexual objects, and they rated them less competently in the job. So the effects of the personality variables, men who were high in hostile sexism, the individual differences, what they had an effect, but the other effects of being primed with sexualized and sexist images and being in power both had effects across the board, across all men. So what this research suggests is when we think about sexism, we don't have to think just about implicit bias, what we're going to talk about later, things that people don't recognize. We can talk about explicit bias, bias that people are very aware of. I don't think in that Rudman and Borgita study, I don't think the men didn't know that they were looking at the women's bodies while they were doing the job interview. And of course, that is inappropriate behavior in that setting. And especially so if they're determining whether the person gets the job, but men did it more in that situation when they had higher power. All right. As we think about this and we generalize beyond gender, Fisk and her colleagues developed what they called the stereotype content model. So in that content model, you'll see the relation to ambivalent sexism. And by the way, there's ambivalent racism that looks just the same sort as ambivalent sexism. They noted that there's two dimensions that really matter here. And the dimensions are warmth. Is the person seen as warm? Or are they seen as threatening, as cold, as potentially dangerous? And then the other dimension is competence. Are people seen as competent, or are they seen as incompetent? And if we think about women, and we think about the ambivalent sexism, what you see is the difference between hostile sexism and benevolent sexism isn't on the competence dimension. Men who have hostile sexism, they actually think that women aren't competent, and they treat them such. That's what happened to Lois Robinson. The difference is on the warmth dimension. They think that women are warm and they should be treated warmly if they're high in benevolent sexism. But if they're low in warmth and competence, then you have hostile sexism. Women are treated, so the difference between ambivalent and ambivalent sexism, the difference between benevolent sexism and hostile sexism is on the warmth dimension. Both, though, view women low on the competence dimension. From this model, you basically can get four types of groups in how they're viewed from these two dimensions. So you can have groups like women are viewed, and by hostile sexism, you can have groups where the predominant reaction to them is antipathy, dislike, hostility. Those are groups that are low in warmth and competence, seen as low in warmth and competence. But you can also have what Fisk and her colleagues call paternalistic treatment of members of groups. And those are groups like benevolent sexism, where groups are seen as low in competence but high in warmth. Those groups that are low in competence and high in warmth, you take a paternalistic orientation. They might even be liked, but they're seen as not competent, not capable. So when President Trump says, "Oh, I love women," you could love women, but still be paternalistic in the way you deal with them and not see them as competent. So warmth and competence often separate those two. But if you think about it, you can have different reactions to group. You can have groups there where what's seen is envious prejudice. Envious prejudice is when you see the group as high in competence but low in warmth or social ability. And as we're going to see, a number of groups actually are seen as in this envious quadrant, and that's not a good place to be either. And finally, this group is usually reserved for the in group, and as we're going to look at the research, we see very few groups actually make it here, and that's admired. And that means groups that are perceived as being high in warmth and in competence. And usually the in-group is the only one that ends up in that quadrant. So let me describe the work that Fisk and her colleagues did in examining this stereotype content model. And notice all of this is very blatant stereotyping and prejudice. You're just asking people what they think of the different groups. So what she did is she had a sample of students and a sample of non-students, fairly big, and this study was done in Massachusetts, in Springfield, Massachusetts, so she had people from the community and students at UMass, I guess it's in Amherst, Massachusetts, so around there, the middle part of Massachusetts. And they rated 23 groups on warmth, competence, status, and competition. And they plotted how they scored on warmth and competence. And they looked at what groups clustered together. and you can do a statistical analysis to see how people respond similarly on warmth, comfort, status, and competition. How they respond similarly, what groups they rate similarly. And here's what this plot actually looked like. And if you look at the plot, what you'll see in the upper left quadrant, where they're high in warmth and low in competence, you see kind of the classic benevolent sexist group, housewives. You also see they're using old terms because it's a somewhat old study. People who are developmentally delayed, the elderly, the blind, disabled, people who clean houses. That actually is getting closer to the antipathy dimension. Low in the bottom left, you see Hispanics, poor whites, poor blacks, welfare recipients. You see a group that's actually kind of interestingly middle on competence, kind of low warmth. So they're getting close to that antipathy quadrant, but not quite as extreme. Gay men, blue-collar workers, Southerners, migrant workers, sexy women, and Arabs. And so that tends to be, that's almost, that's antipathy, but not as extreme. And then you get a group of envious prejudice, and groups that are seen as high in prejudice, low in warmth. And that includes high in competence, low in warmth. That includes black professionals, northerners, northern business women, Asians, Jewish people, feminists, and the rich. That's where the envious prejudices are. They're assumed to not be high in warmth, but high in competence. So low in warmth, high in competence. What's conspicuously missing is that admired group. Groups that are high in both. And if you go the midpoint of the scale, there's almost nobody who's high in both. If you do the midpoint of the scales, there's no group that's high in both. Some are closer to the middle, but nobody ends up being in the admired quadrant of the 23 groups that they looked at. I'm going to show you a simplified version with a much more diverse sample from students from Colorado, Central Massachusetts adults, Wisconsin adults, Florida retirees, Illinois retirees, to make sure it isn't something about age. And this time they rated just 6 groups to keep it easier. They rated them again on warmth, competence, status, and competition. They used a shorter questionnaire to make sure that, they were looking. Notice when you only have 6 groups and you're going to put them in 4 different quadrants, you can't be rating many of the groups the same, so it's not as if people are responding to groups in the same. And they plotted how they scored on warmth and competence, and this is what the plot looks like. Again, you see they're not quite as low on competence, but you see in that in the paternalistic quadrant, housewives and the elderly tend to be there. You see in the low quadrant, welfare recipients. And then you see the envious quadrant. And again, you see rich, feminist, and black professionals. And we really see the quadrant show up with just 6 groups now with a much more diverse sample. You see again that not always are groups, just like when we looked at sexism, groups aren't always stereotyped in the same way. Some men were characterizing women in the low quadrant. And we saw a little bit about that in the study 1 and some of the other work from Fisk and her college. Men who are high in hostile sexism put women in the low quadrant. Men who are high in benevolent sexism put women primarily in the paternalistic quadrant. But that doesn't mean that these can't shift. And in fact, when you think about any group, any 2 groups, they're not simply in one quadrant or another. What Fisk and her colleagues argue is we often create subgroups or subtypes that include both a hostile group and a paternalistic group. And we saw that with some of the group, black welfare recipients and black professionals. That one actually contains a hostile group and an envious group. But we can also get, and it's quite common to have a hostile group and a paternalistic group. That's the argument with women and ambivalent sexism. But think of Muslim terrorist, which would be very much a hostile group or an antipathy quadrant. And we can think of Muslim refugees. That's very much a paternalistic quadrant. And we often put groups, larger groups, we will subtype them into two quadrants at the same time. And groups that are often thought of as envious prejudice often have subgroups or subtypes that include both hostile and paternalistic groups. So you can imagine this, and some stereotypes at some academic institutions. I don't know whether this is true at Ohio State. Think of some Asians as kind of rate busters who are ruining the curve, and they're too studious and they try too hard. Boy, that's a real strong envious prejudice, real high in competence, real low in warmth. But you can also think of Asian social outcasts, where now the competence dimension is not academic ability, but it's social ability. And then Asians get moved into, if they're seen as social outcasts, get moved into the antipathy quadrant, where they're really, really disliked, as well as seeing not good in this area. One of the questions that I think is posed by all of this work on explicit bias is, why do explicit stereotypes have the content that they do? Where does the content come from? Well, there's a lot of different answers to that, and we're not going to be able to go into that in detail in the class, but let me just point out some of the theories that really matter. One of them suggests that our explicit stereotypes are part of our culture, part of the history of the culture, and they're perpetuated by the media, both older media, more recent media that draws on older media. The stories of our culture, as they're portrayed by the media, can very much lead to explicit content of the stereotypes. But I think we need to keep some other theories in mind, and theories of prejudice and where it comes from, and how that could direct the stereotypic content, and particularly as we relate those theories to the stereotype content model. So one of the major theories of prejudice, which was developed in the 1950s after World War II, to explain how could so many people in Germany come to hate Jewish people so much that they were perfectly fine with Hitler trying to kill all of them. Now, not everybody felt that way, but obviously society as a whole went that way. The people had to drive the trains to Auschwitz, and where people were killed by the millions. Why do people go along with stereotyping in that way? And the argument was, at the time, and it's still an argument that I think is very relevant today, is that some people in society look to authority figures and they will follow those authority figures in denigrating other groups. And what you see is people who are high in right-wing authoritarianism want the norms of society to be very carefully followed, and they want the leaders in society to not be challenged, and particularly not be challenged as they criticize other groups. And right-wing authoritarianism, if you think about it, it is about evaluating groups negatively, primarily on the warmth dimension. Right-wing authoritarianism emphasizes hostility and prejudice, emphasizes hostility, and that hostility towards other group is what comes out of that sort of an approach. We can contrast that with a different theory, which in many ways seems similar, which has been developed in the 1990s, primarily in social psychology. It's called social dominance orientation. And this theory emphasizes that stereotypes function to maintain status differences in society. And what people want is to move up in status, but also to keep the status differences that exist, and they don't want people upsetting those status differences. So the groups are on top should stay on top. And I'm going to focus, if you're high in social dominance orientation, I'm going to focus on status. And I want more status, but I also don't want the status hierarchy to be addressed. Now, social dominance orientation is about status and hierarchy, and as such, it emphasizes the competence dimension and keeping things the way they are. So benevolent sexism is often about not letting women rise because, after all, they should be in the low competence side of things. Social dominance orientation doesn't care much about warmth and how positively groups are seen and how positively they're evaluated. Their social dominance orientation compares about who's seen as competence and who has status and who doesn't. And we can actually, there's a third and I think important theory as well, which is called system justification, which emerged in the late 1990s, more the early 2000s. This theory emphasizes that what people actually like is complementary stereotypes. People being competent but not warm, and warm but not competent. And the idea is system justification argues that people want to see the world as it is fair, even when it's not. And one way to do that is if people have bad outcomes, you can focus on the rewards they get for competence. If people get bad outcomes in competence, you can focus on the rewards they get for warmth. If people if people are not well liked, but yet can be seen as competent, that can be seen as fair. So in this work, it's classically seen that you can think about poor people, but people prefer to see poor people who are happy. And they prefer to see rich people who are unhappy, because that suggests that the way things worked out is fair. Everybody gets a little something in their regard. Now, each of these major theories could explain why people want to go, how people would be moved into different quadrants. And you can think about that in, I think, a number of different interesting scenarios when you look at how bias will play out for different groups. And the theories predict things that are a little bit different. Let's take the example of immigrants. When we have a lot of immigrants come into any country, how are they going to be viewed? Well, right-wing authoritarians, they're going to have a propensity towards negative views towards immigrants. But if immigrants are going to be acceptable, what's really they have to do is they have to fit in and follow the rest of norms in society. They want people who are high and right-wing authoritarian, a strong melting pot model. If you come in as an immigrant, I don't like you at first, but what I'll like you is if you become like everyone else. You follow all the norms and you fit into society and you become just like everyone else in society. That's what right-wing authoritarianism talks about. Now, social dominance orientation, when immigrants come into society, they don't like them either. But social dominance orientation is perfectly fine with immigrants who stay at a low social status. They're perfectly fine with immigrants who come and, let's say, become illegal aliens and work for other people. As long as they keep that low status in society and don't rock the boat in terms of trying to change the status in society, people who are high in social dominance orientation are perfectly fine with exploiting immigrants as long as they are, as long as their status at the bottom of society is maintained. Now, system justification, on the other hand, would look at immigrants, and as immigrants came in, it would argue that the preference in viewing immigrants is if they have complementary stereotypes. So if immigrants succeed, then they should be seen as low in warmth. If immigrants don't succeed, then they should be high and seen as high in competence. So it's perfectly fine to have immigrants who don't succeed much as long as they can be seen as warm. It's perfectly fine to have immigrants who succeed as long as they aren't perceived as being warm. And you have those two quadrants would be filled up with various immigrants. And so each of these models, I think there's a fair bit of evidence. I think each of them play a role in how, when immigrants come to a country, for example, how stereotypes about them develop and how they can fit into different quadrants. And you can think about different groups being explicitly stereotyped in different ways, kind of which of these forces is dominant in a region, in a time for that particular group, will say a lot about why groups would have the particular stereotypes that they would. So let's take the example of blacks in the U.S. The historical context of blacks coming to the U.S. is predominantly in slavery. Well, when a group is enslaved, these actually line up much more the three orientations to push towards antipathy. Right-wing authoritarianism is about emphasizing the warmth dimension. So that antipathy is there from the very beginning with right-wing authoritarianism. And if groups are anything but slaves, they're going to be viewed very negatively to maintain that social order of right-wing authoritarianism. Social dominance orientation, although it's fine with groups being at a low status, in order to maintain that low status, social dominance orientation, you're going to the very bottom and you're going to be subjugated forever. The role that plays in antipathy isn't hard to see either. And system justification is a little bit different for a group that comes as slavery. You might be able to see slaves as being happy and distort them as being happy. That's what it's going to be, but no competence is going to be allowed. So all three groups, all three theories, you could see how push that one, groups don't come on their own as immigrants, but come under circumstances where they're forced to come, that it's going to push for more of a model of that group as towards the antipathy quadrant. Okay. That's what I primarily wanted to tell you about implicit or explicit bias. Now I want to change gears and think about much more subtle prejudice and talk about implicit bias, partly because it's a big part of the discussion these days and it's a big part of the research in social psychology. Now, the research on implicit bias really began in the mid-1980s. A paper was published in the late 1980s at Ohio State. Patricia Devine, her dissertation, I believe, really set the agenda for studying implicit bias, and she was a graduate student at Ohio State. And what her argument was is that basically everybody at an unconscious level is going to be prejudiced, and what separates people is whether at the conscious level they fight against being prejudiced. So that's the basic argument that she wanted to test, and she did, I think, a very interesting set of 3 studies to try and make this case. So first she wanted to demonstrate everyone knows the stereotypes. In some ways, this is like the study that has to be the most easiest to predict. Certainly of these 3, maybe of any study ever. What she did is she brought people who scored high and low in prejudice against blacks, and what she did is she said, write down, not what you believe, every stereotype you've ever heard about blacks. And everybody wrote down the same really long list of stereotypes that they've heard. And it turns out, whether you're high or low in prejudice, I think incredibly, not surprisingly, show. So everybody knows the stereotypes. If everybody knows the stereotypes and they're deeply ingrained in society, then maybe everybody will automatically activate the stereotypes, even without them knowing about it. So what she did in this particular study, which was very clever, is she had um, 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 what she did is she showed people on a screen, and she flashed words that were consistent with the stereotype or weren't consistent with the stereotype. And she flashed them so fast that people really weren't seeing the words. And in one condition, 80% of the words were stereotypic and 20 weren't. And the other condition, 20% of the words were stereotypic and 80% of them weren't. And the words were, things like ghetto, black, so they're very clearly basketball, very clearly stereotypic words. And then what she did is she had them read a paragraph about a guy named Donald. There's no indication at all whether Donald is white or black. He's just a guy named Donald. And he goes through a bunch of ambiguous actions, like he demands that his landlord repaint his apartment. He buys something at a store and the clerk gives him the wrong change back and he demands his money back. So the question is Donald aggressive or not? And when people were flashed very quickly with predominantly stereotypic words, they saw Donald, who wasn't necessarily white or black, they saw him as more aggressive than when they were primed with when they were flashed really quickly with very, very few stereotypic words. And that in prejudice didn't matter for that at all. People high and people low in prejudice, everybody saw Donald more as aggressive when they had saw the stereotypic words or where they were flashed. They didn't really see them. If you asked them if they saw them, they'd say, I didn't see anything. So when the stereotypic words were flashed, compared to when they weren't, they saw Donald as more aggressive. This is an indication that the stereotype was activated and influenced their judgment of Donald. And then the last study that they looked at, they brought in high and low prejudice people, and they simply asked them, they have as much time as they want, there's no implicit processes going on, which stereotypes about blacks do you believe? And not surprisingly, again, pretty unsurprising study, high prejudice people believe more stereotypes than low prejudice people. They're kind of better because that's what the scale is supposed to measure. And what Devine argued from this is everybody knows the stereotype. Everybody activates the stereotype when they're exposed to stereotypic words. But high prejudice people then endorse those stereotypes, whereas low prejudice people fight against those stereotypes. Now, this led to a number of different questions, and what particularly got questioned was whether that study 2 was actually right. Does everybody automatically activate the stereotypes? And what that research has basically found is at an individual level, it's not true that everybody activates stereotypes in the same way. And there were 2 really interesting different procedures that come to the same conclusion. And these are the sort of things that are usually used to measure implicit bias. Now, the first one of these, which is hard to do, but I think makes a better case for individual differences in how much people automatically activate stereotypes, was a study done again here at Ohio State by Russ Fazio, who's one of our professors still here, and it's what he called the bona fide pipeline. And the reason he did that is there used to be something in social psychology called the bogus pipeline, which was a way to trick people into telling you the truth. Well, this is a way to actually measure the truth of how they feel about things. And the procedure is actually pretty simple. What he does is he gives people a whole list of words, and the words have some stereotypic words, some non-stereotypic words, and he just flashes them to people and says, try to remember them. Then he gives them a list of faces. Some of the faces are black people, some of the faces are faces of white people, and he asks them he asks them, try to remember these words. And then he says, now we're going to do both tasks at once. Sometimes it'll be a word, sometimes it'll be a picture. And what we want you to tell us is whether the faces are black or white, and whether the words are words or non-words. We're going to throw in some non-words in there. And sometimes you do a version of tell us whether you've seen the face before or tell us whether you've seen the picture before. Either way, the question is, when you see a black face and a stereotypic word, does that speed up the evaluation of the stereotypic word when these things are presented randomly together? And the argument is that people who, when a black face speeds up the recognition of a stereotypic word, you're actually showing there's an association between the category, black people, and the stereotypes, whatever those words are that indicate the stereotype. Now, that actually was a very interesting study. When there are some interesting relations to the divine work. It turns out some people are motivated to control prejudice, others aren't. If we want to know whether the implicit measure is related to standard measures of prejudice, we find out it is for people who aren't motivated to control their prejudice. But for people who are motivated to control their prejudice, their implicit measure and the explicit aren't. Presumably, they have this implicit impulse, which they override when they're motivated to control prejudice. We also find, if we put people in demanding circumstances where they interact with a black RA in these studies, the black RA thinks the interaction goes better, not primarily on explicit prejudice, but primarily on implicit prejudice. Another measure, I had you all do that as part of the task, and if you haven't done it in the assignment, you can. It's called the implicit associates test. And a similar type of process goes on. I'm not going to tell you exactly, but again, because not everybody has done that yet, you'll get an experience. Go do that and see what it's like. But in this, you use your left hand to indicate what different types of words are, and your right hand to indicate what different types of words or pictures are. And the question is, when you're using the same key, does that speed you up or not? So let's say you're using the same key as you will be doing it for black names, and you're using the same key for, in the study you're going to look at, feminine objects. Does black and feminine, using the same key, make you faster than male and white? And so the question is race and gender implicitly associated with each other on that sort of a test? I think you'll understand that a lot better after you do the actual measure. That's why I'm having you do it. You get a couple points for doing that. Okay. Now, but let's think, what is the consequence of these implicit bias measures? Would implicit bias really affect anything that really matters? And the answer is yes. And this study actually was inspired, sadly, by a real-life incident in New York City. In the 1990s, late 1990s, maybe early 2000s, it's right about at the turn of the century, at 2000, there was a man in New York City named Amadou Diallo. Amadou Diallo was an immigrant from Africa. And he was visiting, minding his own business, visiting a friend, and 18 police officers surrounded him. And they were looking for somebody else who had committed a crime. And all he did is he took his wallet out of his pocket, and he was shot 41 times. So here's a black man who was shot 41 times simply for taking his wallet out of his pocket. Now, that horrible incident inspired Josh Correll, who's the first author on this, to see whether that sort of process is related to implicit bias. The police officer shooting Amadou Diallo is related to implicit bias. And what he had people do is he had people, and here's an example of a stimuli, actual stimuli from the experiment, in different parts of Boulder, Colorado, where he did the study. He had black men and he had white men. And in some pictures, like these, they were holding guns. In other pictures, they were holding things like a wallet, based on Amadou Diallo, or a cell phone, or a comb. So you either have a gun or you have, non-threatening objects. And the job of the participants in the study is they're supposed to be like a police officer. And if the guy has a gun and is threatening them, they're supposed to shoot. And if he doesn't have a gun, they're supposed to not shoot. And the question is, does the race of the person holding the gun affect how likely it is that they will shoot? And is that as a dramatic demonstration of implicit bias? And what Josh finds, Carell, in all his studies, what he actually finds is that if you put people under time pressure, so they have to make the decision really, really quickly, they're more likely to shoot the black man than the white man. If you give people as much time to make the decision as possible, they can get it right, but it takes them a lot longer to not shoot the black man than the white man with the gun. And so in these critical decisions where we're talking about police shooting, it's pretty clear that implicit bias can affect whether that happens. So I think it's important to keep in mind that implicit and explicit bias often work together to affect the expression of prejudice. Just like we could think of quadrants of stereotype content, first on warmth and competence, as we talked about before, we can think of people in 4 quadrants of stereotyping based on their implicit and explicit prejudice. So you can imagine there's some people who are going to be low on explicit prejudice and low on implicit prejudice. These are people you could almost think of as really low in prejudice, both implicit and explicit. Now, those people should be a lot less likely to discriminate, either at an implicit or an explicit level. But some people are going to be low on explicit prejudice, but high on implicit prejudice. And this is exactly what Devine sought to study in her. She really was arguing almost everyone fits here. Everyone activates the stereotype, but actually people don't want to be prejudiced. So she was actually arguing that an interesting case is people who are low in explicit prejudice and high in implicit prejudice. And I think we'll find out, as we're going to see, that is a really interesting case. And then you could think of some people are going to be high in explicit prejudice and high in implicit prejudice. And these are the people who discriminate openly. They're not hiding their bias, they display their bias, and they talk about it and are biased. So the first group, people who are low in both, are people who are genuinely low in prejudice. But you can have people who are mixed, who are low in explicit prejudice and high in implicit prejudice. And they're an interesting group. Hard to think about exactly how to characterize those folks. And then you have people who are high in both, and those are people who are, just obviously prejudiced, bigots. So there is a third group, but just like in the quadrants in warmth and competence, implicit and explicit bias, this group is relatively rare, but we can imagine it happens sometime. People who are high in explicit prejudice but low in implicit prejudice. You could imagine some immigrants who come to a country, they learn the norms about prejudice quicker than they develop the habit of thinking prejudicial ways. So explicitly, they say, I don't like that group. But implicitly, they don't they wouldn't show negative evaluations to the group. There's actually, and I think this happens at different times in different ways, there's actually a classic social psychological study from the 1920s that I think fits this group really well. In that study, they asked people, it was, remember, it's in the 1930s, leading up to World War II. It was when the study was actually done. And remember, there was a lot of antipathy towards Japanese people. It was the the threat was in the air that we very well may go to a war with Japan. And so there was a lot of negative views. So the person, really, he was a journalist who did the study, and it's really more of a demonstration and a piece of journalism than research. But he called a bunch of hotels and restaurants in California and asked, "I'm going on a trip with friends of mine, and they're a Japanese couple. Will we be able to eat at your restaurant? Will we be able to stay at your hotel?" And at that time, everyone said, "No, we don't want to serve any Japanese people. We don't want any Japanese people staying in our hotel." But when he went around and actually went to the hotels and restaurants, of the 80 or so that he went to, only one denied them service. It seems like a classic example of this last quadrant. Explicitly, they're prejudiced. We won't serve Japanese people in our restaurant. But implicitly, they actually, when we look at their actual behavior, they very well may not have been as prejudiced as they were letting on in the initial study. So let me look at a particular study that I want to talk about, though, that's going to focus on the group that Devine did. These people are often called aversive racist, people who score low on explicit scales but high on implicit scales. And this particular study, done by Penner and his colleagues, looked at doctor-patient's interactions based on doctors' implicit and explicit racism. So they measured implicit and explicit racism among a number of white doctors in emergency rooms in Detroit. And then after black patients interacted with doctors, they had the patients indicate how much they liked and trusted the doctors. Now, Penner had the idea it might be particularly problematic if you're coming into a doctor and they say all the right things, but their behavior is all negative towards you. And so he argued the aversive races, the people who are low in explicit and high in implicit, would be the ones that would get messed up relationships. And that's exactly what he finds. These measures here are standardized measures comparing the two to one another. And what you see is that if the truly low prejudice, or low on both explicit and implicit that are much lower in prejudice, they were viewed the most positively. If you're high in explicit prejudice, that ends up not being so bad for the doctor-patient interaction. It's professional, it's distant, it's cold, but, he's giving you the information. What's particularly problematic for black patients is this doctor who's low in explicit but high in implicit, because he says the right things, acts like he's not, explicitly tries to be non-prejudiced, but his behavior is leaking all the negative feelings for implicit prejudice. And so it's an example, and in general, what we find in interactions between whites and blacks, when they're dealing with somebody prejudiced, know how to deal with that. They don't like it, they don't think it's great, but it's out there and it's up front. Where it's particularly problematic is whites who are low in explicit and high in implicit. Those are the whites that are particularly confusing and difficult to interact with. Okay, let me give a summary of what we've talked about so far. Explicit stereotypes easily arise and can easily dominate interactions when high-power people interact with low-power people. Think of Lois Robinson and Ann Hopkins. In different ways, explicit stereotypes utilized by high-power people created environments that completely undermined Lois Robinson and Ann Hopkins. In different ways, but completely undermined both. These stereotypes can take on ambivalent forms of prejudice where some members are hated and others are patronized. Think of the two types of sexism, hostile sexism and benevolent sexism. Related to this ambivalent prejudice, stereotypes can be characterized as being primarily about warmth, primarily about competence, or both. If stereotypes can be primarily thinking the people are cold but not incompetent, envious prejudice. Primarily about competence, that's the paternalistic quadrant. I love those people, they're just not very competent. Or they can be low in both, and it's I hate those people and they suck. All three of those types of are common. Notice the fourth quadrant is the one where it's completely absent from the research, the admired group, and the only time in Fisk's work where she finds people there are in-group members. Not saying that in some conditions it might not happen otherwise. Stereotypes can also be implicit in that our awareness of how they influence our actions and potentially even their existence, that we even have those stereotypes, is outside our awareness and is not realized. And I think a good example here is think of the shooter bias studies. So implicit bias and explicit bias can often work together to affect intergroup relations. And the study that we just talked about by Penner and his colleagues and doctor-patient interactions is a good example of that. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I will have another lecture posted on Wednesday with the last two on controlling stereotypes and changing them. Thank you for listening and have a really good week.